Alright, what's up, Dragon Brood? Now that we've talked about the cards I thought are the favorites out of this set, now I wanted to spend a little time talking about cards that are a little bit underrated. Maybe things going under the radar, or things that people don't necessarily like that are going to be better than we think they are. Maybe these are cards you want to target to maybe say, hey, if you find them on the cheap, you can pick up a few of them and see if maybe you can turn them into something. But either way, let's talk about these cards. I'm going to start the list with Sheoldred. Now, this is a little bit weird to have on an underrated list because I think the card is actually quite good, and I've been singing the praises of this card since it first came out. I mean, it's a 4-mana, 4/5 with Death Touch, and you get to gain life every turn, and your opponent's going to lose life every turn at a minimum, and that's not counting you finding a way for either of you to draw cards, right? But the thing about this card is I think a lot of people jumped out hating it because they expected something different. I think this is a case where people's expectations simply weren't met and has nothing to do with the card itself. Because I think people wanted this big, like, I don't know, 6 mana, 6/6 or 7/7 that has some crazy ability and just really looks like a big, awesome Predator for story purposes. But realistically, this card is going to translate very well to the tabletop. I would almost venture to guess that any deck playing mid-rangey or aggro black is probably going to want this card. I mean, even in a mid-rangey deck, it's a 4/5 blocker for 4 that's going to drain your opponent every turn effectively for 2 life. You're going to gain 2, they're going to lose 2 till they get rid of it. And if you're playing an aggro deck, then if you can get your opponent low enough, they're just going to die by not dealing with this card if nothing else ever happens. So yeah, this card's really good, and I think being underappreciated by a lot of folks just because they didn't get what they expected, but you still got quite a good card here. All right, now that we got that out of the way, let me go ahead and let's talk about a couple of honorable mentions real quick before we do the rest of the list. And I want to start with Llanowar Greenwidow. This is the card that I think could find a home. Now, I don't know if it goes in mono green aggro, maybe yet, because we still have some other things that are 3 mana, 4/3s, kind of, sort of, that already exist. But this card's actually very good, and the fact that it comes with 2 keywords with the same cost as other cards you're already willing to play. And it's going to be bigger on the front end, and if you have anything that pumps your creatures, it could be very good. But what I like about this card is that it actually is kind of stealthy neat that late in the game, if it's in your graveyard, you can actually just get it right back. And it doesn't seem to have any restrictions on it or anything. Now, the cost is expensive, but in most decks, you're going to at least reduce at 1 if you're playing mono green. If you're playing any type of, like, Gruul aggro or something, you're probably going to be able to reduce it by 2, and if you're playing any of the multi-lands like Jetmir's Garden, then you'll be able to reduce it by 3, and then it actually becomes pretty affordable. So this is a card I would at least keep my eyes on. Now, do I think it's going to be game-breaking? Not really, but if there's those decks where you're just looking for a solid 3 or 4 mana creature to include, this is one that's very easy to splash, only having 1 green in the cost, and it's a reasonable size body with some long-term play to it. Now, another one that only made my honorable mentions list is Serra Redeemer, and the reason being is I just don't know how viable this card is. Like, 5 mana is not a ton, but it's like just enough to be inconvenient, but it is doable. And, you know, a lot of your ramp creatures only cost, or actually only have power of 1 or 2, so you could get this out fairly efficiently, and then even if you draw them later, they're still going to be +2, which means a lot of your stuff is going to be 3 and 4 power right out of the gate. And this doesn't even mention if you find a way to squeeze this into a tokens deck, right? Because then now every token is going to also be +2. So you're going to be making 3/3s at a minimum and anything else that pumps them up. So I actually kind of really like this card. I just don't quite know where it belongs. That's why it ended up in my honorable mentions pile. All right, and then my last one in my honorable mentions is Jaya, Fiery Negotiator. And I'm actually going to read Jaya because she has like 4 abilities, and there's no way I'm going to get all these right if I don't. But these are all actually reasonable abilities, and she even starts with 4 loyalty, which is also reasonable. So you can make a creature, which is fine. She can protect herself, get a blocker, but it's a creature with prowess, which really does matter. And then you can also just get to look at your extra 2 cards, right? So you get your best of the next 2 cards, or in that turn actually is 3 cards because you draw 1 then look at 2. So that's actually really good as well. She has a possible removal ability that whenever you attack, you can actually kill something. And then the last one is we get an emblem that does lots of crazy stuff whenever you play a red spell because you get to copy it. So there's nothing really wrong with this card at all, and having 4 reasonable choices is pretty good. Now, realistically, it's 3 choices, because if you're using the other ones, you're probably not going to get to the top end. But is there a world where we can play this and play Chandra? Like, maybe. Are we only playing 1 Jaya? Possibly. but this card's actually good enough that we should be giving it real consideration. I think people just want to dismiss Planeswalkers when they're just not obvious or way over the top, but I think this is where we are now for a bit, and this is just a solid card, so nothing wrong with Jaya, really. All right, now back to our actual underrated cards. We're going to talk about Urborg Lhurgoyf, and I actually said that right, because that feels like a tongue twister for no good reason at all. But this card actually could be important to several deck types. When you're talking about different types of reanimator decks, self-mill stuff, maybe decks that are trying to get more lands in the graveyard and do stuff with like Slowkirk or some of those things, I think this is going to be really, really neat for a lot of decks. And it's a super viable card, really, even just having it later, because it does fill the yard itself and give you a shot at growing its size. But if you draw it later after a bunch of creatures died, well, now you have a sizable body just on the table for a fairly low cost. And it has some benefits for kicker and milling extra things, but really, this is a reasonable body for the decks that want it. Now, I don't think this is going to be a card you auto-include as one of your beaters in some aggro deck, but I think for the decks that are already playing along this axis, this is kind of that middle ground tool that some of those decks needed that didn't exist yet. Now, this next one's one I don't think I've seen anybody really talk about, but Stronghold Arena. Now, one, it's cool because it's an Abzan tool, and we haven't really had many of those over the last few years, so I'm really super excited about that. And it's a cool card because late game, it could just be a way to gain 6 life, because you gain 3 for each time you kick it. So I like that aspect of it too. It's just like, hey, here's a chance to give yourself a chance to get off the snide if you're at like 3 life or something, right? You can gain some, and then you have a bonus if you want it. And then if you just get it early or whatever, it's solid against a lot of decks that maybe they're playing light on creatures or whatever. Well, now every time you connect, you get the option of getting a card off the top of your library. Now, if they're lands, obviously they cost you no life at all, and if you're playing a super aggro deck, then maybe your creatures are cheap anyway, and you're willing to pay 1 to 3 life to get a bonus card. The benefit to that, though, is that then if a sweeper does come, you already have tools to rebuild immediately. So I like what this card is providing, and it's giving you multiple shots at getting cards every turn, which is also pretty cool. So yeah, lots of stuff going on with this, and I'm kind of surprised I haven't seen extra conversation around it, but I think this card's better than a lot of us have given credit to. Now our next one up is Cult Conscript. Now, this is one that has been talked about a little bit, so I'm not going to say this is completely underrated, but mostly I've seen it mentioned as part of like, hey, is this the tool that mono black aggro needed? Or maybe even some like low to the ground black something aggro. But one of the things I think has gone a little bit missed is sacrifice decks might actually want this, because it's going to be pretty easy to keep getting it back out from the graveyard. So if you have some other tool or mechanism that can let you sacrifice it and maybe you get a benefit from it, or even if you're able to sacrifice and generate mana, well, now you just have a creature you can just keep getting out every time, which is actually pretty cool. Now, it does come into play tapped, and that's its own thing, but the card actually is playable and solid. Now, the only real downside to this card is that it doesn't really fit any of the generally standard deck types, so it's not like a zombie or anything like that. It just happens to be a skeleton, and we lost just now the card that actually cared about skeletons, so we lose that benefit. But outside of that, I think the card's actually very playable, and just having something you can get back out of the yard at a moment's notice is also pretty good. So yeah, I think this card can fit a few places, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it show up in a couple of spots. Yes, Serra Paragon. I don't, I mean, this card. Okay, so first off, you can play a land out of your graveyard, which is great, or actually play a thing that costs 3 or less. So now the first thing I want to say is if you're playing it in some situation where you can replay the land, worst case scenario, you're going to get a land every turn, right? Because you're either playing one of the new lands out of like New Capenna where it like sacks and you search for something, or maybe even you've cycled a land and you can put that back into play. Or you're playing an older format where fetch lands are legal and you can do that. Or maybe you're just, I don't know, strip mining your opponent every turn. Like, all of those are actual viable scenarios for ways you can use this card. But once you start talking about 3 mana things you can play alongside this card and keep getting back, then we start getting into a weird territory, right? Because now, admittedly, we're not talking about standard anymore here, but there's still like the Righteous Valkyries and such of the world. Like, those only cost 3 mana. So keeping that in play is huge for those angel decks, and this happens to be an angel as well, so it fits right in there. But then even in context of standard, there's some really problematic cards that cost 2 and 3 mana, namely stuff like Rafine. So you go out of your way to get rid of this card because it's super powerful, but now they play this and then they're able to play it right after that. Like, this is going to be very annoying for a lot of reasons, like especially later in the game where they have mana and now you can play a spell and play something out of the graveyard. Like, this card has potential to be very good and very annoying, and honestly, I expect to see this a lot in Commander as well, because there's a ton of small creatures that you sacrifice to search, maybe destroy an artifact or an enchantment, you know, add counters to a thing. Well, now you're just going to get to do that every single turn with this card out. All right, next up is Llanowar Loamspeaker, and I'm saying this is underrated because I don't think people have really processed how good this card is. Now, we've had a bunch of cards over the last, I feel like, at least 4 or 5 years. It kind of has become the standard of you get something for 2 mana, it's usually like a 1/1 or a 1/2, and you can tap it for a mana of any color. Hell, we still have some of those in standard right now alongside this card. But this is actually different. One, it produces mana of any color, which is great because it's going to help solve a lot of problems, and you're going to get to put this in a lot of decks. However, this is a 1/3, and that doesn't seem like a lot, but that blocks a ton of stuff early on and can keep your opponent at bay to where they're not actually getting a real advantage attacking into you. Hell, even against something as simple as the Boros aggro decks, like this can block down against a Thalia. That's really saying something for a 2-mana creature, because not many things can at 2 costs. But then even beyond that, later in the game, when you don't need it for mana, you can just say, all right, well, I'm just going to tap this and turn a land into a 3/3. So now I actually have an attacker. Now, I will say you can only use it as a sorcery, so you can't make a 3/3 blocker, but that's still totally reasonable. And then there's probably some weird scenarios where you need something to sacrifice, or who knows, maybe you need something to exploit or whatever. Well, now you can just turn a land into a creature. Now you have something you can get rid of. So lots of cool stuff you're going to be able to do with this card, and I'm actually kind of excited to put it to use, because it's way better than a lot of the other mana creatures we've had recently. All right, Defiler of Flesh. This actually really does end up on a true warranted spot of being underrated. And I think the problem is people try to compare all the Defiler... Oh, excuse me, I just hit my microphone here. But I think people are really trying to compare all the Defilers to each other. And I think the reality is a lot of the... Each of them's going to function differently, right? They can't all be the same or necessarily equal because they're fitting different deck types and each color identity. And in this case, I think people have kind of underplayed the fact that this is still a 4-mana 4/4 with Menace, right? This is still a problem for your opponent to deal with. And you can even play this alongside several other quality Menace creatures that already exist in the format. So you can be making blocking really difficult for your opponent in some variations of mono black or black based aggro decks. But then on top of that, if you do play another creature after this, or not even a creature, just a black permanent, and that does matter because there's a few like sagas and things that go into those decks, well, now you can give something else +1 and make it menacing. Or if the opponent only has 1 blocker, you just make this +1 and now you're attacking with the 5/5 menace creature. So this is a real nuisance without being crazy. It's just a really balanced card. Is it crazy over the top good? No, but being able to possibly give multiple things menace on a turn that may not otherwise have it, or even just make them bigger to get extra damage in, isn't anything to turn your nose up at all. And then the last card on my list is Jodah the Unifier. The reason I put Jodah on this list is, one, it is 5 mana, but we've already talked about some cards that can help you cast it, so that's not all that much of an issue. But legendary stuff is obviously a real key point in this set. And let's not forget, each of the last few sets have had several legendary creatures, so we have a lot to pick from and work with here. And on top of that, we all know that stuff like Coat of Arms is actually a very good card, and this is like Coat of Arms for legendary creatures. And then we still have stuff like Mirror Box that could also make that even more powerful to get multiple bonuses. I don't even know how that would work, because then they each get a bonus for each other copy that's in play, but then they would get an extra one for Jodah being in play. So yeah, you could have some really big dumb creatures without a lot of effort. And heaven forbid you work in Ratadrabix or whatever, because then now when stuff dies, it doesn't count as being a legendary, even though it's still legendary, and like then it gets silly. So lots of things that Jodah is going to lead to, honestly. It's a surprisingly powerful card, and I'm not really sure why Jodah got such a buff, but I'm here for it. I think this could be really fun and exciting, and a very interesting card to play with. Now there's 2 things. I'm curious, 1, is there anything that you thought was underrated that you thought I was going to mention that I didn't? And 2, if you're curious about what my favorite cards were in the set, I'm going to go ahead and link this here so you can go check those out, because that's a whole different list to talk about. But that's all I have for you for now. We'll see you next time.